everybody. Welcome back to the Convo Couch. I'm Fiorella Isabel. Happy to be here. And of course, joining me today is Vanessa Beeley. Pasta's out and about today. So I'm excited to have Vanessa on. We're going to talk about the election in Turkey or Turkey. And yeah, I'm welcome, Vanessa.
Hi, Fee. It's nice to be back on with you, and it's good to. By the way, I don't consider myself an expert on Turkey or Turkish politics, but only from I guess, from a Syrian perspective, Syrian-Russian perspective.
Yeah, and I was watching your video that you did with Patrick Henningsen on UK Column. So I thought that was a really good analysis, because when it comes to Turkey, there is so much, I think, of a complexity in what specifically Erdogan, but where Turkey stands geopolitically as what it has been. A lot of the times when we've talked about Erdogan, it's kind of like he has seemed like a slippery figure, somebody that, to say the least, that has done, taken advantage of doing things that was most convenient. And it's hard to pin him because we humans, especially in the West, tend to want to look at things as like good versus evil, black and white. And it's been something where Erdogan's fair criticism against him is obviously related to Syria. It's just something you can talk about. But in other ways, he has most recently not been so friendly with the West because of his NATO, his stance pretty much on Russia. And it's a very big deal with what's happening. So I just want to start off by asking you, how Erdogan has been a figure of destruction, a figure of doom for the people of Syria, because people tend to go or nothing, criticize him obviously for a lot of things, but in essence, his opponent, who has a very difficult name to pronounce, it seems a lot more Western backed, a lot more preferred by NATO. So it's kind of a interesting position to be in. So first of all, I just want to hear your take on Erdogan as a politician and as in relation to Syria.
Well, my understanding of Erdogan is he came very much from kind of the back streets, pulled himself up through the ranks. He was made mayor of Istanbul in 1994. He was elected, ironically, in 1999 on the back of another earthquake tragedy that his predecessor, whose name it slips my mind right now, didn't handle correctly. So bizarrely, he came to power post-earthquake bad handling by his predecessor. And now, of course, in 2023, he's facing serious criticism for his handling or lack of it after the double earthquake tragedy on February the 6th of this year, which hit, of course, both Turkey and Syria. He's not only, of course, doom and gloom for Syria, but also for Cyprus. He's maintaining the division of Cyprus into the Turkish territory and the Greek territory. He has certainly ramped up confrontation with Greece over the Aegean and obviously over oil interests there. Armenia, he's working with Azerbaijan, and of course Azerbaijan is heavily armed by Israel. So there you have again the kind of the Turkish-Israeli partnership, which you've also seen clearly in Syria, over the Zangezur corridor, which will effectively connect the two territories of Azerbaijan that are kind of divided by Armenian territory right on the border at the south with Iran. And what Erdogan is working on with Azerbaijan is to create a road corridor there. So traversing Armenian territory to join. I need to check that, Nakhchivan, and I've probably murdered the pronunciation of that also, which is Azerbaijani territory, as I said, dissected by Armenian territory and separated from the mainland of Azerbaijan. Now, of course, what that means is that will give Erdogan connection from Turkey directly, because he borders with that territory into Central Asia, bypassing Iran. So, of course, Iran is really not happy with this buildup of really potentially hostile states on its borders, because, as I mentioned, Israel is heavily involved in Azerbaijan also. So, you know, as far as Erdogan is concerned, his neo-Ottoman ambitions are still very much alive and are very destructive, really, to the region. At the same time, Turkey is a NATO member state. And so, of course, he's always kind of playing both ends against the middle. He's been blackmailing the EU over the refugee crisis, which was generated, of course, in a large part by Turkey itself, that was training the terrorist armed groups on Turkish soil, as was Jordan, and then basically allowing them to cross through the porous Turkish borders into Syria to lead the destabilization project against the Syrian government from 2011 onwards. And even though we've seen a lot of flip-flopping in rhetoric from Erdogan's administration, particularly leading up to the elections, where they knew that to some degree they had to court President Assad in Syria, because one of the biggest electoral issues is, of course, the 5 million Syrian refugees that are on Turkish territory. Basically, these refugees largely don't have Turkish residency, and they don't have Syrian papers, because many of them, the fathers will have been killed or are still fighting in the regime change war against the government, largely. And in Syria, the only way that a child can be registered is by the father. Sort of draconian law in Syria, which potentially might be changed, because it's having a tremendous effect on the ability for refugees to return to Syria. So there may be some changes in that law in the future, but for now, only the father can register the child. So basically, this entire community of Syrian refugees are living without really any identity. And so for Erdogan, one of his biggest electoral campaign messages was that he would return at least 1 million of those refugees somehow into Syria. Iran and Russia, of course, have been brokering talks between, until now, the defense ministers and the foreign ministers of Turkey, Syria, Iran and Russia, the last meeting being on the 10th of May, so just before the election in Moscow. But President Assad's red line, which basically puts a huge obstacle in the way of particularly Russia's ambition to get the two presidents shaking hands and agreeing on a normalization process, Assad's red line is that nothing can happen until Turkey withdraws not only its own military, but also, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood factions and Al-Qaeda factions that are under its control, and that are effectively annexing Syrian territory in the north and the northwest. Now, we also know that Turkey, while it's having these negotiations, is still building an extended annexation wall, an apartheid wall, basically, very similar to what you see in the occupied territories of Palestine built by Israel. The trench digging has been kind of put off for some time because of protests in Ras Al Ain in northern Syria. But Turkey has effectively been building and is still trying to build a wall to annex Syrian territory against all international law norms. And the rhetoric from Erdogan's party, including the foreign minister has been very much that they will not make any concessions. So really and truly, we're at a kind of impasse on the negotiations until, let's say, someone blinks. Now, the effect that the elections are going to have, neither candidate, so neither Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, and also I've also probably completely mispronounced that name, and Erdogan managed to reach the 50% that they needed to have a win on the 14th of May and be elected or be declared president. If that happens, I don't think the count is completely 100% finished, but it looks like it's going to be sort of a hung vote, in which case it will go to a second round on the 28th of May. But the AKP party, which is Erdogan's party, has a majority in parliament because parliamentary elections happened on the same day, and the AKP has a majority in parliament. So if it goes to the 28th, it's very unlikely that the Turkish public are going to bring in a party that has a minority in parliament, right? And of course, there has been, you know, a huge amount of backward and forward. The West is definitely supporting Kılıçdaroğlu, the CHP, the Republican Party, the Kemalists or Kemalists, however you want to say it, that kind of promote a secular West pivoting ideology or policy. Now, the interesting thing is Erdogan has been throwing around accusations that Kılıçdaroğlu is pro-LGBT, pro-homosexuality, and of course, Erdogan and the AKP withdrew from the Istanbul Convention in March 2021, which is the human rights treaty of the Council of Europe against violence against women and domestic violence. Somehow this became the catch-all for the LGBT community, and the withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention has, according to some reports, led to an increase in hate crimes against the LGBT and homosexual communities in Turkey. And Erdogan has definitely used it as a campaign promise to his supporters, the majority of which, of course, are Muslim Brotherhood, Islamic, I won't say extremists, but hardliners. And so he's used it as claiming that this kind of structure breaks down the family, destroys traditional values, legitimizes homosexuality, etc. Whereas Kılıçdaroğlu is much more pivoted towards the West, towards the kind of WEF agenda, the kind of digital alliance. And what's also interesting, he was very vague in his manifesto, Kılıçdaroğlu. He didn't really address the issue of Libya or of Iran. He didn't mention Ukraine or China, particularly in the manifesto. And he also didn't mention the various problems in Syria, the Kurdish issue, etc. So he avoided a lot of the hot topics, right? But he is very pro-Uyghur rights. So that immediately tells you that this guy is going to be on the side of the West if they go to war with China, right? That's how I would interpret that. So in all honesty, for me, Turkey is between a rock and a hard place. You know, it's like, or it goes even more to the West, and eventually what will happen, it will adopt, I think, all of the WEF agenda, the globalist power grab, etc., because this guy is going to be way more aligned with the West. And of course, the West has been promoting him as secular democracy, harking back to Ataturk's time in the 20s, and away from, and of course, Erdogan's party is seen very much, as I mentioned, of hardline Islamist policy, changes to the laws in Turkey to give the president increased power, but also to give much more power to, I can't remember what it's actually called in Turkey, but to the kind of religious institution Now, for example, if you wish to get married, I believe it's been changed from civil weddings to basically Muslim wedding law. So, of course, you know, many people have been writing about this, that it's a choice between Kemalism and Sharia law. But, you know, for me, neither candidate is particularly attractive, to be honest.
Yeah, exactly. And I wanted to, before I go back to the points you made, I do want to show that so far, the first link, according to Reuters, according to the AP, according to all mainstream media, pretty much, and even Turkish media, this is going into a second round, the runoff, because neither candidate, as Vanessa stated, got the 50% plus one voice percent. Plus 1% of voice is technically it. So it's that's going to happen, I believe, on May 28th. And so they'll go back, and that is the what's going to happen. Oz, there's a second link that has a percentage. I believe Vanessa is correct. I think 99% of the vote has been counted, so not the full 100%. Which, I mean, at this point, probably wouldn't make a difference. It could, but it's highly unlikely, just because of the needed extra percentage point there. So, you know, as somebody that like goes and looks at elections, I'm not too familiar with the Turkish process, but I do know that there were several things, questions that were looming ahead of this election. One was that the opponent, his Erdogan's main opponent, accused him of having Russian interference. Accused the Erdogan of having, you know, Russian interference, of being so pro-Putin. And I don't necessarily think Erdogan is necessarily pro-Putin, but in terms of the relationship with Russia, it has Turkey has refused to condemn Russia in the way NATO wants it to. And so that's definitely been a point of contention, because Erdogan was the darling of NATO and the West for a long time. And recently, of course, this has shifted. And as you guys can see there, those are the results. And that's from, I believe, Turkish media. But I do want to point out that that's a point of contention that was pretty much, you know, surrounding foreign interference. On the other hand, there was potential fear, I think it's still there, of Western interference in the election as well, that the United States would go and try to control the election somehow, and oust Erdogan because he isn't their favorite right now, and he's been in power for a long time. The left in the U.S. criticizes Erdogan as being, you know, anti-LGBTQ, anti-social issues, an autocrat, that's like the, you know, he's not democratic, that sort of thing, which is not entirely untrue. And the criticisms of him aren't entirely, I mean, everything Vanessa said is absolutely true. But on the other hand, Kemal is just extremely, has acknowledged, right, that he is basically going to support the NATO agenda. And there's something that I did hear you mention, Vanessa, about Joe Biden and what he said regarding Turkey, which is why I think that that question came into play, as well as fears from 2016 and that coup, that there could be a domestic sort of interference, perhaps tied to foreign. So those were the questions that were looming. And I don't know if you want to speak about the whole Biden situation, because I do think that did raise some fears regarding the election.
Yeah, I mean, this was really interesting. So this was in 2020. It was in an interview with the New York Times editorial board. And Biden, I can't quote it word for word, but to paraphrase it, he basically said, and this was before his own election, he basically said that he would work with the Turks differently, I'm guessing, to Trump, and that he wouldn't secure basically a regime change, not by a coup, so not by a coup similar to the one that, of course, we'd seen in 2016 that was very likely backed by the CIA using the Gulenist proxies. And of course, we have to remember that Erdogan was very probably tipped off by Russia to that coup in 2016, even after in November 2015, Turkey brought down a Russian fighter jet allegedly in Turkish airspace, although Russia would argue it was in Syrian airspace. And so that demonstrates for me the value of Erdogan to the non-aligned resistance axis, which includes China, Iran, Russia, Syria, Iraq even. And Biden basically in this interview with the New York Times editorial board, he basically said, okay, so we're not going to carry out like a military coup, but what we'll do in 2023 is we will influence the elections. I mean, it really was a very clear statement of intent by Biden at this point. And certainly, I would say, when you look at the media is obviously going to reflect UK, US, EU policy. And if you look at the main instigators of that within the media complex, they're all going for Kılıçdaroğlu. They're pushing him, they're kind of not really criminalizing Erdogan. I guess they're also playing slightly down the middle. Because they would know how close this election is going to be, so they don't want to risk completely pissing off Erdogan if he does go ahead and win. And also, when the talks were being brokered between Syria and Turkey by Iran and Russia, we did see the US and Biden's administration suddenly miraculously find, I think it was 27, I can't remember if it was million or billion, it all sort of, merges into one these days, in support package for Erdogan and Turkey for the F-16s. So all of a sudden that was released in order to curry favor with Erdogan at a point that there was talk of, normalization with Syria and with President Assad, as has happened with many of the other US allies in the region, like Saudi Arabia. So, yeah, I mean, certainly for me, I don't have any love whatsoever for Erdogan. What he's done to Syria has just devastated this country, and it's still ongoing. Refugees that are trying to return to Syria are being shot, abused, tortured by Turkish guards at the border. As I mentioned, they're still trying to erect the annexation wall in northern Syrian territory. And, what is really ironic is how Erdogan is using the Kurdish terrorist card as his trump cards, excuse the pun, because he's basically saying, the proxy that the US is backing in the northeast of Syria and trying to create the autonomous region, for example, using what is effectively the PKK. Yes, it is. It's majority PKK in amongst that SDF, YPG rebranding. And yet, both parties, so Kılıçdaroğlu is using the Kurdish vote to try and bump up his support for his six-party coalition. And Erdogan is actually using the Hüdapar connection to try and bump up his votes. Now, Hüdapar is known as the Hezbollah of Turkey, but it has nothing to do with Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's just simply got the same name, the Party of God. But actually, they're extremist Sunni Kurdish factions, many of which are actually fighting in Idlib alongside Al-Qaeda. So, I think this demonstrates the realpolitik hypocrisy that goes on in these situations. And of course, ultimately, how Russia and Iran and even China to some degree, Iraq and Syria view it is who is the best candidate to continue to attempt this normalization process between Turkey and Syria. And for them, it would have to be Erdogan, regardless of the history of Erdogan's own authoritarianism and extremism in regards how he's dealt with Syria for the last 12 years. So, you know, it's not an easy pill to swallow. And as I've said, I would be the first to point out the crimes of Erdogan over the last 12 years, particularly in Aleppo and the northwest. But from a realpolitik point of view, better the devil you know, I guess, for Russia and Iran in particular.
Yes, and it's really difficult to be in that position, which is why I wanted to have you on, because you know pretty much you live in the region, so you know exactly the consequences of such actions. And it's so hard to even say this because it always seems like we've been ending up in the position of who is the less evil villain, which is not a good position to be in. Yeah. But it seems like the endless position that, you know, we find ourselves in. And one of the other questions that, you know, I've been covering this pretty much all day today, that was posed to several Turkish analysts and that was asked was, you know, will the foreign policy change with a victory from Kemal? Because obviously, as we've stated, he definitely has laid out to have a more WEF pro-NATO agenda. However, the relationship between Turkey and Russia is actually pretty intertwined in many ways economically. There is that Russian nuclear power plant that's also going to be built. There's the tourism industry. This is something that, especially right now, Turkey is the only place, one of the few places nearby where Russians can go, because you know, to get a visa is a huge problem to go anywhere in Europe. Obviously the United States, they're basically banned. And so that there is that industry as well. There's other economic partnerships that have been built, and that relationship has benefited not just Russia, but Turkey as well. And so a lot of people were saying, a lot of locals were saying, you know, regardless of who wins, you know, Kemal may be talking it up, but really, how would a lot change when that relationship is so vital to Turkey as it stands? On the other hand, the United States, we know, and the West is eager to not lose an ally. They've been losing allies left and right to BRICS countries, to this, obviously, this shift away from Western unilateralism and the shift towards, you know, BRICS, China, Russia, towards multipolarity, towards de-dollarization. So they have found themselves in an extremely vulnerable position to be in. And if you look at the region, obviously they can't really afford to lose this sort of interesting relationship they have with Turkey. So it's a very interesting position to be in. If you want to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, it is. Historically, of course, Turkey has had a policy of non-alignment and independence, regardless of who is in power. And even going back to Ataturk times, Turkey had very good relations with the Soviet Union historically. You know, so this isn't something that has happened overnight. And yes, as you mentioned, you know, Turkey is now the resource hub for Russia to bypass sanctions. So it's very important to Russia also to continue this partnership. Of course, what people do worry about in Syria is to what extent is Russia going to protect its relationship with Turkey over its relationship with Syria. And of course, we have seen degrees of that, particularly during the military operations, and particularly since 2018, when the terrorists were forced to withdraw from southern Idlib to north of the M4 highway that joins Aleppo to Damascus. We did see a degree of Russian, let's say, lack of reaction to Turkish incursions and establishment of Turkish bases and collaboration with terrorist groups in Idlib against Syrian Arab Army positions. So, that is the fear in Syria. So far, of course, Russia is respecting Damascus sovereignty because, as I said, President Assad has made it absolutely clear that there will be no normalization process without a guarantee to withdraw troops. And another thing that nobody is actually mentioning here is the kind of hydro-hegemony war that is going on between Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. Many of the rivers that actually traverse Iraq and Syria and provide essential water supplies to both countries have their origins in Turkey. And Turkey traditionally, I'm actually sort of preparing something to write about this because it's a long-standing issue. For example, in Hasaka, fairly regular in the northeast, Turkey has closed off or reduced the water flow to 2.5 million civilians in that area, causing temporary drought conditions and big problems for the civilians there. And throughout history, Turkey has been responsible for that. And many people in Turkey perceive, well, the origin is in Turkey, it's our water, we don't have any responsibility to supply Iraq and Syria. And of course, during the war, they cut off, for example, the Quake River supply into Aleppo and left the people of Aleppo under siege by the terrorist groups without any water supply at all. So Turkey has weaponized its water sources. It has built dams over maybe the last 100 years. It has negotiated various deals with Syria and with Iraq to keep the levels at a sufficient level to be able to supply the populations of both countries. But it's reneged on that deal also on a number of occasions. And all of these, it's really interesting, as I said, when you look at the manifesto of Kılıçdaroğlu, none of these big hot issues are mentioned in the manifesto. So one wonders, okay, you can be optimistic and say, look, this guy isn't going to increase on what the AKP has done regarding its foreign policy in Syria. But how do we know that? Because there's no policy. They simply haven't addressed these really important issues, and that kind of worries me. And that brings me back to, at least there's that history with Erdogan of what he's done through the last 12 years and of addressing it. However, if Erdogan is re-elected and he has the majority in parliament, as we mentioned, then to some degree that election, how to say it, carrot has been lost because he's won the election and nothing was agreed prior to the election, if you see what I mean. So I honestly, I don't know. I have a feeling that we're going to see some more shenanigans on the 28th. There is potentially going to be some kind of vote fixing and so on, because at the end of the day, both of them, there's an awful lot at stake here for the US and for the non-aligned axis. So remains to be seen what happens on the 28th and also what happens in between. We are going to see further negotiations and further meetings. I'm guessing, I'm not quite sure what happens in that interim period. I'm guessing that Erdogan's administration maintains control until the second round.
Yes, so there was a third candidate, which was known as the spoiler candidate, right? Because they got about 5% of the vote, which would have made the difference now, which will make the difference coming into the second round. That's usually how it happens. And this candidate, a lot of people are saying his votes will go to Erdogan. However, he did make a comment saying he he would urge his supporters to support Kamal under certain conditions. So it's hard to say where that is going to go, but it does seem like people are reporting that Erdogan has the momentum right now, that he is likely to clinch his victory. Of course, that is without any sort of interference, without any sort of shenanigans. And I do have a feeling we will see some, because there is a lot riding in this election. There are a lot of interests, a powerful interests at play. And when that happens, of course, you know, that that there's potential, especially in Turkey with its past, that has been tumultuous when it comes to their election. And you know, all day the certain Turkish reporters and certain Turkish analysts were saying, "Oh, we had a very democratic election. We had a very democratic election." You know, Turkey always has democratic elections, but a lot of people would beg to differ. So it's hard to say at this moment. But in all of that, because you did mention, you know, Iraq, you did mention, I mean, Israel obviously is a player here as well, in the region. Today is Al Nakba Day. You know, it's really interesting what the Arab League has done with Syria, right? And we're seeing this sort of shift with in a sort of way, unity between the Arab nations. And I wondered if you believe that that could also come into play, not just in regard to Palestine, but into the situation in Syria, because it does seem like there is support, more support than before, for nations and people that have been, of course, on the receiving end of you know, death and destruction and imperialism from the West, particularly to military powers, the United States and Israel. And if that could definitely play a role going forward, because the relationship between Russia and Israel, and Turkey and Israel has obviously been one where there has been light treading. They condemn on one end, on another end they don't, and it's just it's one of those things. But it seems to me that it's coming to a point where Israel is so dependent on the West that it's kind of in a position to stand to lose in terms of the Arab League.
Yeah, I mean, I think Faisal Muqdad arrived today in Jeddah. I think the first Arab League meeting is on Friday. Syria has actually sent its sort of top reporters there, so it's an interesting time. From a perspective of Western influenced agendas, particularly the whole WEF agenda, it's interesting. I was talking to someone the other day, and he was describing what's going on as a grouping of the commodity sector. In other words, those that are producing, which of course includes Saudi Arabia, as opposed to those in the West that are effectively just buying, to simplify it, right? So the commodity sector, which is, you know, obviously Iran, Russia, China, and all of the countries that are now grouping, including in Africa, South Africa, et cetera, that are grouping under that umbrella. And he included Saudi Arabia in that. But my point was, you've got to look at how Saudi Arabia is aligned with the whole WEF agenda, the creation of the huge kind of, the colossal 15-minute city, NEOM, N-E-O-M, which is going to be housing millions of people in this kind of macabre, like underground desert city, which just freaks the life out of me. The invitation to the COP28 at the end of the year to President Assad. I guess, you know, my feeling would be, I hope people are aware of this and that they're aware of where Saudi Arabia might try to lead the whole agenda. From an Israeli perspective, of course, you know, this is why right now they're they're trying to contain it by hitting Gaza, by hitting the resistance in Gaza and in the occupied territories. Why? Because if they look beyond the borders of the occupied territories in Gaza, of course, what do they face? They face an emerging neo-pan-Arabism. The only country that is not coming on board that has any significance at all is Qatar. But, you know, Qatar is basically a tiny little country with a lot of money that has funded terrorism in Syria and continues to align itself with NATO and is continuing to fund terrorists and their auxiliaries in the northwest, including the infamous white helmets. And so Qatar is, if you like, the only one left out on the limb of this newly formed alliance, which is effectively pan-Arabist. And so there has also been a lot of criticism within that group, particularly from the UAE, from Jordan, which is very unusual against Israel, partly because of the comments of one of Netanyahu's administration in Paris referenced the expansionist policies of the revisionist Zionists, so taking into account territory in Transjordan and in Syria leading up to Damascus. And so from an Israeli perspective, the resistance against Israeli supremacy and expansionism is united. And so outside of its borders, outside the occupied territories, outside Gaza, it doesn't dare, in my opinion, to actually engage with that resistance axis. So what you're seeing is it's trying to hit the soft target. Mm-hmm. It's trying to hit Gaza, and it has done huge damage in the last few days. But Gaza is not the Gaza of 1 year, 2 years, 3 years ago. It has air defense systems now. The resistance in the occupied territories are heavily armed. I mean, you know, extraordinary battles actually going on the ground. And the Israelis are not renowned for their courage on the ground. They're very brave in the air when they're dropping, you know, developed bombs and sophisticated missiles onto sitting targets in Gaza, for example. But when it's on the ground in the occupied territories, they can't use the Air Force. So it's literally hand-to-hand combat. And so the resistance axis is kind of standing back and waiting for it to spill out into any of those resistance countries, in which case I think the response will be pretty rapid. I mean, from an Iranian perspective, the only reason that they haven't retaliated is that they would have to retaliate from Syrian territory, and they don't have permission to do so, because Syria is not ready to escalate the war with Israel.
Yeah, and just I mean, everything you said was so important, and what's been developing out there. And I guess even though this is sort of not related to what we're talking about in Turkey today, the geopolitical situation is very tense right now, and every allyship and every you know, talk of diplomacy and everything that's happening in the Arab League and everything that's happening with BRICS and Pan-Arabism and Pan-Africanism, that is really playing a role into how everything shapes out, especially when it comes to the WEF and which countries end up opposing that. Where is this taking us? We've already discussed, you know, the belief where China and Russia lie on that. But I did have to ask you, you know, the UK has supplied these long-range missiles to Ukraine, and these missiles were just used against civilians recently, even though they swore that would not happen, that they would never be used against that. Where do we stand on the conflict in terms of how that has, I mean, that is a clear escalation. Moscow has said that it absolutely is. And it seems like that is not ending, not just from the UK, but of course from NATO allies as well in general. Is this election in Turkey a potential, you know, development that could affect the escalation? What are we seeing here in terms of of that potential, and in terms in general of where, where this conflict is going and what it could potentially do, because clearly it's almost like we are already at a world war that hasn't been announced. And
Yeah,
it
yeah.
hasn't been full on, taken. There isn't like a full on, a bunch of countries like fighting each other necessarily, but it's a
Yeah.
proxy war. So it is happening. So where do you see this going?
Well, I mean, I think actually it really started in Syria. And then it just went from Syria to Ukraine. I think from a NATO perspective, what they would probably like to see is for this war to continue for the next 10 years. Because if that happens, the military-industrial complex is, rolling in the profit. It's burying Russia into a quagmire of a war, which it can maintain endlessly. I mean, there's already been talk. We know that Polish troops are already on the ground in Ukraine. I mean, it's kind of a bit of a joke to keep calling it between Ukraine and Russia, and I think a lot of people just don't do that anymore because it's so clear now what is going on, and that Ukrainians effectively are just being sent to die for a NATO agenda to create this quagmire in Ukraine to keep Russia occupied there, while of course they ignite the new front in Africa. And that's something that I've been talking about for some time, and that a lot of Russian military analysts have been talking about, is that the West is building, or NATO is building, a new military base in Mauritania, ready for what they perceive to be the next front against Russia and China, which is in Africa, where of course they've been doing exactly what they did in Syria and in West Asia, and in Afghanistan, which is to foment terrorist groups to justify their military presence on the ground there. They've withdrawn, as I said, to Mauritania. They're building up troops. They're training local troops. So clearly they're preparing for conflict there. And we've seen, the unrest in Sudan. So it's very clear that that is also going to be ignited, or has been already ignited. So keeping Russia kind of militarily occupied in Ukraine is, just as they tried to keep Russia occupied in Syria, now Ukraine, while they build up forces in Africa. I guess we have to remember that for the WEF crowd, the oligarchy cabal in the West, it's all about resources. It's all about control of resources. It's about controlling that commodity sector, global commodity sector, that we were talking about the other day, that is grouping, and what Hartmut, this analyst, was saying, is it grouping to protect itself against this power grab? That's how it appears. Led by Russia and China, they're grouping all of the commodity rich countries, resource-rich countries together to defend themselves, and also to provide energy security, food security globally. That's how I perceive it.
Yeah, so much going on, Vanessa, right now, and so many things to look at. I mean, it just seems endless every day. The news cycle is insane. And yeah, I do think we are seeing potential lights in the tunnels intermittently, but it does look pretty grim out there at the moment. But always good to talk with you. Thank you for coming on and shedding light on what we could expect in Turkey potentially, and from this perspective, a Syria-related perspective as well. That is so important to touch on. Where can people find you? What are you working on next? Any of that?
Yeah, they can find me probably most easily at my Substack, Telegram, Twitter, I guess, although I'm much more on Telegram these days. Social media has just become so impossible.
Yeah. No, yeah. I absolutely. And that's it, guys. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you again Wednesday. Much love. Convo out.